I'm going to go ahead and start recording. All right, so the meeting is recording right now. I also like to thank the Anxiety Treatment Center of Austin for letting me use their team meeting time to do this presentation of this soft launch. I also want to point out that the views expressed in this presentation are by me, and they do not reflect the position of the Multicultural Counseling Institute, its CE programming, or other instructors. The other point I want to make is my positionality in conducting this presentation. I am a cisgender male, East Asian, first-generation immigrant from Taiwan, and I grew up in a Buddhist household, though I do not consider myself a practicing Buddhist. In terms of conflict of interest, as Dr. Weathers mentioned, my role is the program director of the Multicultural Counseling Institute, and I am conducting this presentation. So for this presentation, I'd like to achieve 3 objectives. First is plan culturally responsive mindfulness-based interventions. Number 2, compare Buddhism's right mindfulness versus secular mindfulness. Number 3, identify potential risks and harms when teaching mindfulness-based interventions with working with people of color. My hope is the collection of these objectives can help you tailor your interventions. All right, so before we get into the intervention side of the house, let's do a mindful recollection exercise. You can either have your eyes opened or closed. I'd like you to think back to the time when you first learned about mindfulness or mindfulness treatments. Imagine that setting. Was there an instructor that was teaching this course? Who was the instructor? More importantly, what was the instructor's race and gender? How many people of color were in the class? How many of the authors associated with the research or presentation material were people of color? And when you examine the research that was presented, if you attended a mindfulness-based course, were the participants people of color, or how many were people of color? Did your mindfulness-based class, or when you learned about mindfulness treatment, was there a conversation about religion or Buddhism? And recall back to that moment that if there was any mention of religion or Buddhism, do you recollect what you felt during that moment? So go ahead and open your eyes if they were closed. So I'd like to offer some context of where we are today in the practice of mindfulness. I want to acknowledge that mindfulness exists in other religions, such as Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, and Judaism. However, mindfulness, largely how it is taught and influenced in the United States, is based on Buddhist practices. So here we have a Google search term in terms of popularity. So you notice from the year 2004 up to 2017, or actually up to recent 2023, the blue line denotes a gradual increase of the search term mindfulness. It is gradually tapering off right now. But if you look at the search term for Buddhism, Notice that it was quite popular in 2004 and has, for the most part, declined and converged with the search term mindfulness. So one would expect that if mindfulness increases, we would also hope that the search for Buddhism term also continues to increase, or that there's more interest in it. But that's not the case. So if you look at some papers, also the media, we have here a paper that was published in Psychiatry Research Communications. Notice the title here, The Invisibility of Asians, Asian Americans, and Buddhist Roots in Western Psychology. And we have here a media interview in NPR from July 9th, 2023, not long ago. These Buddhist monks want their faith to be known for more than just mindfulness. We also have a book that was published in 2019 called Make Mindfulness. And notice the title of this research paper, Equitable Mindfulness, the Practice of Mindfulness for All. With such a title, my hope is we question what is going on, where the idea of equitable mindfulness is even contemplated or considered. So when we look at these papers and experiences, we can see the impact of the misunderstanding of mindfulness and how it can even cause harm for populations of color. And as mental health providers, we are in a unique position to deliver mindfulness-based treatments that is culturally responsive, and to do it in a way and to be intentional and not perpetuate the cultural appropriation of mindfulness-based treatments or engaging in microaggressions by erasing the history of Buddhist practices and the link between the Asian American population. So here is a brief history of the Buddha. Now, there are actually many Buddhas, but the most well-known Buddha, the one who is attributed to the teaching, is Siddhartha Gautama. Many may know him as a prince, and he grew up in a palace, and his father actually did not want him to leave the palace to experience any hardship. So in many ways, he was protected. He married at the age of 19. One day, Siddhartha left home, and he saw an old man, a sick man, and a dead man. And he started to realize, I guess, a cognitive dissonance in realizing that how can I lie happily on my silk cushions and not ease this suffering that exists in the world? So he left home at age 19 and wandered in the forest for about 6 years. And throughout that time, he met deep meditation teachers who practiced restrictive lifestyles such as fasting, shaving their heads, wearing simple robes. And this fasting was so extreme that starvation was involved. In fact, Siddhartha almost passed away during this process of starvation. And then one day, a little girl gave him some milk so that he can regain his nutrition back. And as a result of this, the meditation teachers who he practiced with did not believe that he was part of that group anymore. So in many ways, they left Siddhartha. The other way to look at this is Siddhartha also left the group because he realized that there must be another way, because he was not happy during this time. The suffering continued. So he ventured out on his own, and by age 35, sat under a Bodhi tree and began meditating. And he realized, and this was the moment where he became enlightened, as some of y'all who are familiar with Buddhism may know about. And during the Enlightenment, he realized the reality. And so he taught essentially the Dhamma, which translates to the nature of reality, for the rest of his life until he died at age 80. And prior to his death, he knew he was about to die. he gave an advice. There's different translations to this. One is, I was only able to point the way for you. All things pass away, so strive on with diligence. The other translation is, this is my last advice to you. All component things in the world are changeable. They're not lasting. Work hard to gain your own salvation. In being mindful and culturally aware and racially aware, a few nuances I want to point out in his teachings or his experiences that the Buddha was the first religious leader in India at the time to accept women and people from the lowest caste. So now let's look at the Buddha's teaching and where mindfulness comes into play. So the first thing he taught as part of the nature of reality is the truth of suffering. And there are some deep meanings to this idea of suffering. Is underneath it is the idea of impermanence, emptiness, and imperfection. So inherent in life, these are the qualities that are occurring. The causes of suffering, the truth of the cause of the suffering include things such as craving, desire, and a thirst bound with greed. Number 3 is the truth of the end of suffering. And lastly, the path that frees us from suffering. And this is also otherwise known as the middle path, because remember from what I presented earlier regarding Buddha's history, he lived a very rich life, and then he went from a very extreme restrictive life. So he found a middle path. So the path he taught was the Noble Eightfold Path. And pay attention to this, and I'm going to read this to you. It's often presented in this fashion, linear, top-down, but it doesn't denote a specific order in which one must practice. So there's right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. Notice carefully how mindfulness is just one aspect of the 8 principles taught in the Noble Eightfold Path. Also notice the purpose of how mindfulness is taught in the context to end suffering that is inherent in living. That is a key to understanding how mindfulness is being applied. So hopefully later on you can have a chance to listen to the NPR interview with the monks. And one statement that was mentioned when there was a conversation about mindfulness is that what's happening in the literature or in practice is people are taking one piece of this. So for example, if you're trying to bake a cake that requires several ingredients, and rather than producing a cake, you only use one of those ingredients. So you won't really have the cake. Another way to present the mindfulness in context of the Eightfold Path, we break this down into 3 categories: wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. So under wisdom includes right understanding, right thought. Under ethical conduct, right speech, right action, right livelihood. And mental discipline, right effort, right concentration, right mindfulness. So thinking about your experience and how you are taught mindfulness-based treatments, how was mindfulness positioned? What was it anchored under? What's the purpose of mindfulness? What was mindfulness used to help the client achieve? So here are some differences in the definition of mindfulness. So from the Buddhist perspective, right mindfulness as defined by a praxis by which one becomes diligent, alert, and mindful of perceptions of the body, feelings, thoughts, and mental qualities in the present moment in the absence of hindrance. Mindfulness contains remembrance and discernment. Mindfulness has to be practiced with sila, translated to observing moral and ethical principles. Right mindfulness, as it is taught, has been reduced to the definition of paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. So there's a distinction, non-judgmentally versus remembrance and discernment. We are making a judgment in the direction of how we are being mindful. Another statement or quote from Zhang Kabat-Zinn is, for cultural reasons having to do with how common it is in our society to profess a moral stance outwardly that one does not adhere to inwardly, it feels appropriate in our environment that the ethical foundation of the practice be more implicit than explicit, and that it may be best expressed and supported. So notice when teaching secular mindfulness, there appears to be a deliberate washing away of the ethical component to right mindfulness practices. There's also a disagreement in terms of the observation. Again, discernment, remembering, assessing mental qualities versus a non-judgmental approach. So this is a visual diagram of how we may also think about right mindfulness. If you look at the borders of the circles, the very bottom, we have mindfulness of the body. So being aware of the breath, being aware of the posture, mindfulness of one's feeling and experience. Is it pleasant? Is it painful? Is it neutral? Again, you're making a discernment of these qualities. What are the mindfulness of the thoughts? What am I thinking about, recalling? And what are the mental qualities? Mental qualities here is defined as the analysis of activities and the restraint of your six senses of perception, which includes sight, hearing, smell, touch, taste, and mind. And again, you must be diligent, alert, and mindful. There in the middle, you have right mindfulness. This here is a painting that conveys Buddha talking about his teaching. So this is something that may be familiar for some folks. Never mistake the finger for the moon is how Buddha described his teaching. His pointing his finger is what guides you to the moon. Without the finger, you might not notice the moon. But pointing the finger isn't what matters most. It only matters because it helps you see the moon for yourself. So when we consider this metaphor of how Buddha is describing his teachings, and if we look at mindfulness alone, we're not even looking at his fingers. We're just looking at his fingernails. And we're losing sight to what his teachings entail. So notice some of the mentions here is that for right mindfulness, it is a part of an entire practice and has to be taken in context. Are we applying this to end suffering, to help people alleviate their suffering that is inherent to the experience? Or are we using this to reduce symptoms and even reduction of, say, anxiety and depressive symptoms? That does not mean that one will not experience suffering and dissatisfaction. Also, if we plan to work with clients of color, it is important to engage in culturally responsive practices by finding ways to adapt the intervention to help engage with your clients. So we have some studies here to look at here. This is a study that specifically the researchers obtained feedback, conducted focus groups from African-American participants. The intervention was based on Zhang Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness-based stress reduction program. There were instructors who were certified in MBSR who assisted in the curriculum development. The original curriculum was 8 weeks, but it was condensed to 4 weeks. The mindfulness practice that was outside of session was 45 minutes per day. And as mentioned, African-American women were recruited, 8 of them were enrolled, and 7 completed the treatment. The focus group questions, there were 4 of them. These questions include, do you have suggestions for how we might make the meditation experience more inviting? Can you imagine a scenario where you might not want others to know that you meditate? When you think about someone who meditates, what kind of traits or characteristics come to mind? And is there anything else about mindfulness or meditation in African Americans that we don't or didn't ask about that you might find important for us to know? So in going through these questions, several factors regarding the interventions emerged. Resoundingly, the participants mentioned it would be nice to include African American facilitators. Also to include salient cultural values such as self-empowerment, interdependence, and storytelling. Now, for those who are familiar with Buddhism, interdependence is a huge principle that is taught. And so I'd be curious to learn, is interdependence taught in standard MBSR protocols, and why is that not? Also, with storytelling, Zen proverbs are often shared in Buddhist practices. Storytelling is a huge part of disseminating Buddhist practices and ideas. Other things that's worth mentioning that are factors to the intervention when you are conducting mindfulness-based treatments with African American clients is to understand some familiarity with cultural terminology. So meditation, that was a word that was mentioned by these participants, is that it can have the connotation of being controlled by sources outside of themselves, more so like a spiritual experience. So meditation practices were not familiar practices for these participants, and the women feared that meditation could open them up to unfamiliar and malevolent spiritual forces, sort of out-of-body, out-of-mind type experiences. So instead, they suggested consider using words such as awareness, relaxation, and mindful. So when you're thinking about factors external to the intervention, are you willing to address religious concerns? Because remember, mindfulness practice is very unfamiliar for most folks. Is there a willingness to also utilize community-sanctioned locations when delivering or collaborating in the development or delivering of mindfulness-based treatments? The next here is an opinion paper by Asian American authors, although there is one research study that looked at an anti-Asian bias spectrum from microaggressions to violence. One of the items on that survey specifically mentions the cultural appropriation of mindfulness. So when designing mindfulness-based treatments for clients who are Asian, or if you know that you may have Asian clients, stress the importance of acknowledging Buddhist roots. Again, lean into cultural appreciation versus cultural appropriation, and a strong consideration in right mindfulness, or being able to make a distinction between right mindfulness or secular mindfulness. And if you choose secular mindfulness, understand why. Factors external to the intervention. Again, address potential callouts or questions about cultural appropriation. Recognize the white internalization of the current uses of mindfulness, and being aware and mindful of how, as mental health providers, teaching mindfulness-based treatments may perpetuate racism by producing the invisibility of Asians and Asian Americans and Buddhists. So here I'll share a personal story. I remember learning about evidence-based treatment in a large healthcare system. At the time, I did not know that mindfulness was a component to this particular treatment. It was a treatment to address co-occurring disorders. I sat down in a group, and the instructor, who is white, a colleague who is slightly senior to me, began the training or the workshop with breath work. And that was fine. But as it continued and mentions of meditation and mindfulness was brought up, I was finding myself in many ways shutting down from the experience and wanting to just walk away because there was no mention of Buddhism. Not only that, I was the only person of color in that class. Now, there's no fault to the instructor because he was likely taught by the developers of the protocol in this manner. And so consider the signals that we are sending, not just to our clients, but also our colleagues. When we teach mindfulness, that does not incorporate or appreciate the contributions of the Buddhist practice or the Buddhist idea, or how mindfulness is taken out of context. We have here, regarding LatinX clients, this is a paper that was written by Campayo et al., and they looked at the practice of mindfulness in Latin countries. And one of the mention was that there is a high attrition rate amongst Latin clients regarding mindfulness-based treatments. So several considerations were observed or recommended, and that is to reduce the duration of formal practice. So for example, if you're doing MBSR, if you're doing 45-minute outside practice, possibly changing the time of that. Rather than 45 minutes, how can we be flexible? Reduce the retreat component. Okay, some of us have attended 10-day silent meditation retreats. Well, can we revise that to maybe 3 days? Again, being flexible with what your client population might need. With Latinx clients, the importance of actually encouraging mindfulness of the body. So breath work may not work. So what would it be like if the homework assignment involved more mindfulness body scanning? The other consideration is emphasizing interpersonal mindfulness. So maybe sitting down, doing breath work isn't ideal, but what would it be like if one were mindful of right speech, right thought when interacting with friends and family? How do we infuse and embed the practice of mindfulness in interpersonal interactions? The other interesting thing worth mentioning here is the word compassion. So being aware of some of the religious and cultural contexts, such as within the word of compassion, there can be feelings of superiority. Okay. So another study, this was conducted by Blum in 2014, developed an intervention called Mindfulness Allied Project. And the goal of this treatment was to train participants in mindfulness techniques to ameliorate the challenges of mental, emotional, physical, environmental, and structural struggles in life, which include racism, financial hardship, limited mobility, and family obligations. In delivering this intervention, the participants, 45% were white and 55% were people of color. That is a huge improvement when you look at some of the mindfulness intervention studies out there. The anchors or mindfulness exercises used include breath work, body sensations, walking, eating, and brief hip hop exercises. So again, the importance of adapting to the culture. Once the intervention was completed, feedback forms were obtained in terms of helping the author consider and revise future interventions. One mention is having a discussion about the term mindfulness, having that as part of your treatment intervention up front, differentiating between meditation and paying attention. Also, the importance of this training with Blum, he actually attended some trainings himself. He attended anti-racism training prior to delivering this intervention. He took courses on feminism. He is a white mental health provider, and his goal was to try to racialize his own whiteness, which is a message for therapists who are white and delivering mindfulness-based treatments, the importance to racialize your own whiteness. And creating a space to also consider religion and spirituality in the conversation, because mindfulness practice is foreign, it is different from a lot of the religious practices. How do we bring that into the conversation to integrate that as part of someone else's religious practice or your client's religious practice? Another important point is mindfulness. When we teach it from, oh, I'm accepting, observing, seeing things how they are, mindful acceptance is not the same as resigning in the case of racism and sexism. Remember, we presented the history of Buddha, the first spiritual leader who accepted women in the teachings, as well as people from lower castes. Mindfulness does not discriminate. So there's a paper out there that reviewed the potential harms of meditation, or basically meditation adverse events. They reviewed 83 studies from the period of 1974 to 2019. Of the 85 studies analyzed, 55 reported at least one type of meditation adverse event. They can be categorized in three qualities: somatic symptoms, psychiatric, and neurocognitive symptoms. We break those three categories down even further, and you can see anxiety, depression, cognitive abnormalities, stress, tension, and so on. As you're looking through these symptoms, I want to also point out a major constraint or limitation to this particular paper, and it was also acknowledged by the authors, is that there was not a standardized way in measuring these symptoms. It is unclear if these are pre-existing conditions that may have exacerbated during the practice of meditation or mindfulness. Another important point for those who have practiced mindfulness is a lot of these symptoms are expected when we undergo deep meditative practices. Pain is expected. Tension is expected. Some feelings of anxiety and depression may also be expected. So as you're thinking about your mindfulness intervention, how to develop it, before you even consider that, think about also the potential risks and harms. And I want to take a model more so from the approach of managing microaggressions. So before doing the work, are we exploring how teaching mindfulness-based practice, if we do not appreciate or have conversations about race, but more importantly, spiritual practices, we don't create a space for that to get brought up? How might we be perpetuating microaggressions? And I think this is a topic that can be frightening for folks. It's the idea that I don't want to offend others. I don't want to say the wrong thing. And such fear of making a mistake is so strong that we are fearful to approach. It is very likely when doing these interventions, we may make a mistake. But the goal is to repair. The goal is to focus on the growth of the interaction. And I think one Buddhist principle is the idea of skillfulness. Think about your journey in developing as a mental health provider. Think about your journey and conducting these interventions. The idea of skillfulness. You are constantly developing. We are going to make mistakes. In fact, the term skillfulness, the undertone, there's more compassion. I am not as skilled right now. That is okay, but I'm working towards skillfulness. It's not about the fear of making a mistake. So that helps provide the cognitive reframe, is my hope, as you're thinking about delivering mindfulness-based interventions. Incorporate systems thinking. Think about the larger context of how you are delivering mindfulness-based treatments. Remember the signals I mentioned to your colleagues, to your clients. How can we also re-educate clients on mindfulness perspectives? And the importance of conceptualizing how clients experience their mental illness. Beyond just the traditional biopsychosocial model, we incorporate the psychosocial spiritual model. Also being racially conscious. Here's a little short clip here. I'm going to play this.
There is a story, a professor, young professor, not matured in life, but very highly educated. Number of alphabets after his name. A long tail of alphabets. Was traveling by a ship, and in the ship there was also a sailor, a worker there, a very old man, illiterate. Sometimes he will come to the cabin of the professor, listen to his words of wisdom. What an intelligent person, what a learned person, wonderful person. And one day, after some talk, when the old man was leaving, the professor asked him, "Old man, have you studied geology?" "What is geology, sir?" "I don't know. I've never been to any school, I've never been to any college. Please tell me, what is geology?" "Geology is the science of the earth. Have you studied?" "No, sir. As I said, I have not studied anything." "Oh, old man, so unfortunate. You have not studied geology. You have wasted 1/4 of your life." The old man, very sad, with a long face, goes out. Such a learned person says, "I have wasted 1/4 of my life." Certainly, I must have wasted 1/4 of my life. Next day when he came, again after long talk, when he was leaving, again the professor asked him, "Old man, have you studied oceanology?" "What is that, sir?" "The science of the ocean, the sea." "Oh no, sir, I have not studied anything." What an unfortunate person. You wasted half of your life. Old man, very sorry, I have wasted half of my life. And third day again he was questioned, "Old man, have you studied meteorology?" "What is this, sir? I never heard this name." "Science of the wind, the rain, the weather." "No, sir. As I said, I have never been to any school or college. I have not studied anything." "Old man, you are so unfortunate. You have not studied geology, the science of the earth on which you are living. You have not studied oceanology, the science of the sea on which you travel every day. You have not studied meteorology, the science of the wind, the rain, the weather which you encounter every day. Very unfortunate. You have wasted 3/4 of your life." "Old man, very sorry, I wasted 3/4 of my life." The next day it was the turn of the old man. He came running. Professor, sir, have you studied swimology?" "What swimology? Can you swim, sir? Oh no, old man, I can't swim. I'm so sorry, Professor, sir. You have wasted all your life. There is a shipwreck now, and this ship is going to sink. Those who can swim, they will reach the shore there. Those who can't swim, I am so sorry for you. We may learn all the logies of the world, and we don't learn swimology, then what's the use of all these logies? And swimology also, if you keep on reading books on swimology and keep on discussing about swimology without touching the water, then what is the use of this swimology also? One has to learn actually how to swim, because one has to swim the ocean of misery and reach the other shore, free from misery. And this is Dhamma. This is the practical aspect of Dhamma. This alone gives benefit. There is a
Okay, there we go. So for those who have attended meditation retreats, that is Goenka, and he's a very famous meditation leader, and he teaches Vipassana meditation. So here are some steps to consider when developing and adapting your mindfulness-based treatment. First, a therapist, please do our own personal work. Some considerations may include going to a Buddhist temple for meditation sessions, attend a Buddhist meditation retreat, adopt a mindfulness practice on your own or with colleagues. And I think having the collegial support is important. In fact, prior to the pandemic, my colleagues at the Anxiety Treatment Center of Austin and I would set aside time once a month to do a mindfulness practice. So thinking about if you're a mindfulness center, what are some structures you can set in place to facilitate the practice of mindfulness? Also considering reviewing the literature and readings by Buddhist monks or practitioners. Have conversations about race outside of therapy sessions. And what is your willingness to have uncomfortable conversations about microaggressions? And maybe collaborate with a person of color and or someone who practices meditation or Buddhism. And another important recommendation is to take the implicit association test. I myself have taken this test. So there's a lot of different tests. There's a race test. There's also the Asian American test, Hispanics, gender. There's a lot of IAT tests you can take. Some pre-treatment assessment considerations, which is when you're having clients fill out intake forms, make sure that the race demographics include multiple selections. Ask about their spirituality and religion, so you go into the treatment knowing that, oh, this may come up, and how do you incorporate that as part of the conversation? Understand your client's mental health history. Is there a history of psychosis? If there is, how can you adapt the mindfulness treatments rather than, for example, having your eyes closed, keep them open? Suicidality. Again, if that is a history coming into this practice, being aware of how that might play out. Trauma history. And for some of us who work with OCD, understand the themes of scrupulosity. Ask about any potential accommodations and barriers to the practice of mindfulness if the practice outside of session is going to require 45 minutes a day. And possibly ask about a client's history or experience with mindfulness practice. Some treatment factors to consider is, how are you presenting your marketing materials when you're describing your mindfulness intervention? Are you going to define it as simply just a non-judgmental awareness, or is it going to add to that? mindfulness is being practiced in a context of a larger system. Is that how you're going to present your mindfulness-based intervention? When you're doing your intervention, consider the pacing and timing of your mindfulness practice in and outside of your session. The time, 45 minutes, 10 minutes, so on. The types of mindfulness anchors that are used, breath, body work, hip hop, dance. Okay. Also, at what juncture will you be using these interventions? So for example, someone with trauma history, does it make sense to do body scanning early on as opposed to later on once you have established some degree of rapport with the client? Incorporate cultural salience such as storytelling, interdependence, empowerment. These are concepts that are actually embedded in the Buddhist practice and teachings. Consider co-facilitating with a person of color. And by the end of the treatment interventions, always collect treatment feedback. And as you're delivering your treatment, there is a revision process because you're also being flexible with who you're recruiting. Sometimes your patient population can change. We want to understand your patient population as they are changing. So here is a reading list to consider if you're thinking about delivering or implementing mindfulness-based treatment. And from here, I will go ahead and move with questions. And there is an option to ask questions anonymously. If you look at the very bottom right-hand corner, you'll see a triangle, a square, and a circle. If you click on that, you can select the Q&A, and then you can ask a question anonymously, or you can ask your question in the chat screen. And I'll go ahead and post a link to the evaluation. If you have any questions, you can type it in the chat screen. There we go. So I'll read out some of these questions. I was wondering if you would consider act metaphors a form of storytelling. I would say so. I would definitely incorporate act story metaphors as a form of storytelling. Yes, great question. Can you say more about racializing your whiteness? So I think, and I'm not an expert in this area, but I think it's the idea of acknowledging first, what are some privileges that I carry when I come into this treatment session, knowing that I am white? Am I learning about myself? Am I understanding, for instance, when conversations about race gets brought up, am I feeling defensive? That's oftentimes a common response. And if, let's say, a person of color mentions, hey, I didn't feel comfortable with that statement, I think that was microaggression. They may not use that term microaggression, but they may say, hey, I was comfortable with that statement. Are we willing to step back and ask, am I responding defensively? Is what they're saying helpful? And I do have some books back here. There's a book, White Fragility. Highly recommend. Also understanding the position of by being white. If you are teaching mindfulness-based practice, what are the implications? Again, taking a stance, trying to deviate rather than being fearful of this, help yourself understand what it means. Because racializing the whiteness is this idea that we don't see ourselves as white, or if you're white, you don't see yourself, you're white. You're just the default. Whereas oftentimes in research, it's Asian American, Black, Hispanic, Indigenous, so on. But race, white is a race, and oftentimes is not thought of as a race. So there's a lot of different ways and constructs in thinking about how to racialize one's whiteness. All right, any other questions? Lauren, do you see any questions on your end?
I don't. I actually kind of have a question I wanted to talk out, if that was okay.
Sure, go ahead.
So I do a lot of mindfulness work within, like, for my OCD clients, especially, like, so we'll like kind of look at in a non-judgmental way their response to intrusive thoughts. So basically kind of what's keeping them perpetuated in their anxiety loop, and also like kind of what rituals are they doing. And so for certain types of OCD, I really stress that non-judgmentalness. But I was thinking about how so much of like something that you emphasized was that sila, or the observing of moral ethical principles. And so I guess what does that look like in some of the OCD work?
Yeah, so yes, you're observing, for example, so remind me, what's the particular OCD thought?
So I'm thinking more about like harm OCD, or like some I guess like let's use that as an example.
Okay. So if the thought is, I'm afraid that I'm going to hurt someone, I have this
Mhm.
knife, I'm going to stab someone. Well, you have that thought. And yes, to be mindful requires one to understand I'm having this thought. And what's really underneath that thought? Are you going to give yourself permission to lean into, to recognize that this thought is not helpful, that I have this fear? What's really underlying the fear? Underlying the fear could be some sadness. Okay, and how do we engage in a loving way? Right thought, right thinking, loving kindness. These are all ideas. How do we love ourselves and be compassionate in a way that we can understand the purpose of the thought, or what's really driving that thought? And so when we're being mindful, we're just observing, but why? To what end? What's the purpose? Why are we doing this? These are big questions to ask.
And I think a lot of that does come down to the discernment that they don't want this pattern, and that this pattern makes them uncomfortable, and it's not truly who they are. And so
Yes,
that makes a lot of sense.
I don't want this pattern. I want to escape this. And so here's a quick story. During one of my meditation retreats, I experienced profound pain, and I wanted to go away. Very much, if we can look at this idea of the thought, I want this thought to go away. And it was so painful. It was very sharp, like a knife pain. Went from my back all the way up to, or the seat of my back to my upper back. I had thoughts of, I'd much rather get punched in the face by Mike Tyson, okay? Because it would just be a quick thing and it's gone. The pain is gone. I wanted the pain to go away. But I recognized that that was not a skillful thought. And I incorporated this idea, well, what's really underlying this wanting this pain to go away? Because inherent in life, we're going to experience pain, but I don't necessarily have to suffer from it. So I gave myself permission to actually feel and think through the pain. So thoughts, even thoughts such as degrading myself involves such as, oh, you can't deal with the pain, right? You need to suck it up. What's really underneath that message? And of course, as I was meditating, observing my breath, noticing how shallow it became as I was going through this experience, I also thought, wait, where's this thought coming from? How do I, in many ways, accept that I'm having this thought, and I also have emotions underneath that thought? And so once I gave myself permission to feel the sadness inherent in the thought of the criticism that I should suck it up, and once I gave myself permission to cry internally as I was sitting there in deep meditation, yeah, I had a profound experience. The pain was there, but it wasn't as intense. Rather than being the pain in the front of my eyes, it moved back. So that hopefully paints a picture in terms of the mindfulness perspective, which is we will have these painful experiences, thoughts, and emotions. Are we giving ourselves permission to see them for what they are? We're not really seeing it if it's anger. It's unskillful, as the Buddhist practice will say. How do we really see what's underneath it?
Thank you for giving that specific example, just because with chronic pain, sometimes that, because there is that mindfulness component to treatment. And so I'm happy that you included that example, just because that can be tricky with clients sometimes, because it's like, no, I don't want to think, I don't want to sit with this. But that's I think your example was awesome about kind of leaning into it and discovering what's underneath.
Yeah. Well, we do need to wrap up, and I really appreciate everyone for having attended this presentation. This is a soft launch, so your feedback is important. Again, if you run into any issues, please send me an email, jack@tmcinstitute.com. Thank you.
Thank you.